You know, it seems like just yesterday that Benny Walker and I met with Calder at the Fish Market restaurant on Haywood Road. And we listened to Calder talking about this incredible program that Coca-Cola had begun, and this magic man named Juan Johnson who was running the program, not only in terms of Coke globally, trying to change the corporate culture of Coca-Cola, but also on the ground in Atlanta. Calder came back mesmerized, getting on the telephone, calling a number of groups around, and when he got to us, and Dick Riley and I understood the value of this program, not only for the upstate of South Carolina, but for the whole state of South Carolina. You know, we have been challenged by a lot of legacies that have held the state back, held groups of people back who should not have been, people that are not part of the social and economic mainstream of the state, that have kept us from being globally competitive in a global environment. And I listen to Benny and I talk about this all the time, what a magic meeting that was. Also, it was a magic meeting too when the Inclusion and Fusion group looked at a number of things that they thought would be a great thing to do for the upstate of South Carolina. And they wanted to honor diversity. They wanted to honor something that we could leverage to make the upstate a better place. Honor people and honor organizations and corporations. And so they began to work on this. We looked at it, we thought this was fantastic. They asked the Riley Institute to help with this, because they understood if you were going to create something that could be sustained, and this is our 12th year, that you needed something larger than just that 8-person capstone group. And Tom, I see you over there. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Tom Davenport. So we talked, Ben Heskew and I talked, and so we've had this incredible collaboration between the Riley Institute, Furman University's Riley Institute, and the Greenville Chamber and the other chambers in the upstate with this magnificent organizational collaboration have done something that no other organizations have done across this state, and any of the other 49 states as far as we can tell. We've looked. We're very proud of what you all have put together, these huge number of DLI Riley Fellows that are out here. It's hard to believe that we've been here for 12 years. It's really an honor for me to be able to, and a pleasure, to be able to introduce my good friend John Simpkins. I've known John Simpkins for a good while. We met at first as instructors. I took the summers from Furman and went down to be an instructor in the original governor's school of South Carolina down in Charleston. John took off from law practice and came down, and we taught what was then the original governor's school. We taught what would be called the state's best and brightest. Well, John was actually one of the best and brightest himself. He was a Govey when he was a rising senior at Lexington High School, and right before he headed off to Harvard for his undergraduate days. When I actually met John, he'd already finished Duke Law School, and he'd already done something else that I was extremely impressed with. He had taken time to go to apartheid South Africa, really a very dangerous place for John to go and teach in a school in South Africa before 2000, before Nelson Mandela was taken out of prison and allowed to become president of South Africa. John wrote in the state paper about his experiences there, a very impressive, very courageous thing. When John got out of Duke Law School, he would go on to practice law in a very prestigious Washington firm. And I would persuade him to come back from DC and join me at the Riley Institute as the first associate director of the Riley Institute. He would also teach courses in the political science department. Actually, it wasn't me that was that persuasive. It was Dick Riley. John has a strong and long-lasting friendship with Dick Riley, and I know that's the real reason he came back to South Carolina, and I appreciate that very much. John would go on from Furman to to be a professor in the newly formed Charleston School of Law. He would run a remarkable diversity-oriented program there. To say that John is a fantastic teacher is kind of an understatement. Even now, years and years and years after he taught at Furman, you have the groupies that follow John's every move where he is, and I keep getting emails and questions all the time, where's John now? Well, John just cannot sit still or do one thing very well. He does everything very well. He would be of counsel in the White's Law Firm in Greenville. He would be among the first DLI graduates, Riley Fellows, in the upstate class 2. John, I think your capstone group was the Palm Squad. I'm not sure exactly what you guys did, but it sounds good. But they not either, they say. Okay. He would become a Liberty Fellow. He would work with the Aspen Institute. He would be a part of every one of the Riley Institute's One South Carolina conferences, and he would constantly seek additional education. He would leave the Charleston School of Law to study for a PhD in international law at the extremely highly regarded University of Melbourne in Australia. In fact, if you peruse John's resume and that of his wife Carolyn, you would see this. You would see undergraduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford, an LLM from Duke, a JD from Duke, a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins, an MD from Duke, a PhD from Duke, and almost a PhD now from the University of Melbourne. I think it's a hobby, but whatever it is, John seeks education. When you get to know John Simpkins, you come to understand that he has amazing energy. He has a huge passion for those whose lives are challenged by poverty, by being born in circumstances that make social and economic progress for them and for their families difficult, if not impossible, or who live in countries where dictatorships and authoritarian systems of government severely limit the lives of ordinary people. John actually has done a lot in the international world. Beginning with his work in racially segregated South Africa, John focused on building democracy and constitutional reform in Africa. Over the years, he's been incredibly active. He's consulted and conducted research in comparative constitutional law and constitutional design in Nigeria, in Liberia, in Kenya, in Uganda, in South Africa, among other countries. And he has taught as a visiting professor in Canada, in New Zealand, in China, and in Spain. Until 2015, he served as the Deputy General Counsel of the White House Office of Management and Budget. And of course, now John is the General Counsel for USAID. It's an extremely important post as we work to make the world a better place. Earlier tonight, while I was out in the foyer, a couple of people that I know who are from decidedly different political parties said, wouldn't it be lucky if John returned to his home state and served as our governor? Yes, we would be very lucky. Folks, our keynote speaker tonight, John L.S. Simpkins.
I wish I had some walk-up music like everybody else. Don Gordon is relentless, if nothing else. That last little plug is something I've been hearing for the last 15 years. Perhaps if there's sufficient constitutional change in this state, then we might think about something different. He's also relentless because he's put me on the spot as being perhaps the PhD student at Melbourne who's taken the longest leave of absence so far. It began when I went into the administration, and it continues, thankfully. Hopefully one day I will be able to complete that. There's a tradition in Australia, whenever there are gatherings like this, the person who's leading the welcome, who's starting the ceremony, recognizes that the event occurs on land that used to belong to indigenous people. And at the beginning of every event, they honor the ancestors from those groups and their members past and present. I think that's a good tradition. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering here this evening on the traditional lands of Native American peoples who once called the upstate home. I would like to recognize their members, past, present, and future. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge those who have cooked, cleaned, and served this evening, making our time here all the more enjoyable. I don't know about you, but I'd much rather hear from Rowan or Justice, because it sounds like they're pretty interesting, and I hope they get a chance to get up here and do what I'm doing at some point. But I'd certainly like to thank the Greenville Chamber and all the other sponsoring chambers, Denny's, President Davis, Secretary Riley, who did what my mother could not do, which was to get me to move back to South Carolina after I had left. She is eternally grateful for that. And we had a wonderful, wonderful time here in Greenville and certainly in Charleston as well. Don Gordon, who has been a friend and exemplar for decades now. And I learn a lot from him about not only his subject matter, which he doesn't actually talk about a lot, but Don is an Africanist, and he is an expert, a recognized expert in African politics. And I appreciate him giving me the opportunity to be a part of the beginning of the Riley Institute, a part of the beginning of what was then DLA and what is now DLI, and witness and party to the bromance between Calder Erman and Juan Johnson, one that continues and one for which we're all the richer. So it has been a wonderful, wonderful experience all along. It feels good to be home. I say that whenever I'm in South Carolina because I consider all of this state my home. Having lived in the Midlands, where I grew up, in Lexington, the upstate, and the low country, I feel like I've been exposed to much that is great and good about our state. Greenville, in particular, holds a special place in my heart. As 11 years ago yesterday, my son Jonah entered this world at Greenville Memorial Hospital. His celebrations continue today with a class trip to the mountains, but he sends his regards. While Jonah celebrates, so many in this country and around the world can find little to cheer. It's interesting to me that in a position where we're meant to go out and help people, I actually have people in the rest of the world wondering, what can we do to get the U.S. right? Because you guys seem to be a little off lately. Friends in Palestine and Ramallah saying, well, is there something we can do to help you guys turn things around? It says something about the time. Anxiety has rushed in like a wave, sweeping up all in its path, a path of uncertainty and even panic. Now, political observers explain the rise of Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right as a reflection of fear and anxiety about our country and its future. And yet, I could think of no time or place that I would prefer than 21st century America. Though the current political events do have me, as the kids would say, feeling some kind of way, I'm reminded of the mood and attitude pervading the last speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968. It's the night before he was assassinated. Because I see both similar tensions and similar opportunities. And he was optimistic. Of this optimism, during another turbulent time in American history, King said the following. Now that's a strange statement to make, he said, because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement, but I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same: we want to be free. And another reason that I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history. But the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men, for years now, have been talking about war and peace. But now, no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That is where we are today. And also, in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done, and done in a hurry, to bring the colored peoples of this world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. Now, I'm just happy that God has allowed me to live in this period to see what is unfolding, and I'm happy that He's allowed me to be in Memphis. So says Dr. King. And I'm happy that God has allowed me to be in this period for many of the same reasons articulated by Dr. King. I'm specifically happy that God has allowed me to be in South Carolina tonight. Not so much because I believe that things are just as bad as Memphis in 1968. And there can be no doubt that problems remain, from mass incarceration to persistent unemployment to ossified class systems that lock hardworking people into a permanent state of vulnerability. Serious and fundamental problems. We have achieved much in almost 50 years, and we have so much more to be realized. The cry remains the same. We want to be free. Not just for the people of color of the world, but for all who constantly feel the hot breath of the wolf at the door. For me, this marked much of my childhood, dressing in front of an open oven because there was no heat in the house, skipping lunch at school because of the embarrassment of being on free or reduced lunch, and letting the phone ring because you always knew who it was and what they wanted. And I was one of the lucky ones, the son of a South Carolina public school teacher, no less. What is undeniable, though, is that we cannot go back. This country is forever changed, and that makes me incredibly happy to be alive at this moment, in this moment. A two-term African-American president is about to leave office, and it has been the privilege of my career to serve in his administration. Now, the contenders to succeed him are a Jewish socialist from Brooklyn, a reality TV star, and a former First Lady. Think about it. This isn't a presidential campaign, it's a primetime television lineup. This election has given us a choice between Curb Your Enthusiasm, The Apprentice, and House of Cards. And if Ted Cruz decides to get back in, you can throw in the Munsters as well. Each candidate mirrors the concerns of his or her supporters, but there also is a shared sense of dread. This wariness is, to my mind, what animates so much of the anxiety and vitriol in this campaign. People do want to be free, yes, but they also want to matter. They want their values, their lives, and their choices to count for something. The current scourge lingering in the background for so many is the fear of being left behind. In its most benign moments, it emerges as what we now call the fear of missing out, FOMO. But the true danger in missing out is in not being included, in being left behind, in not mattering, in becoming invisible. And that is a social death. Of course, for some, invisibility is not new, nor is it news. For centuries, large segments of our population have been invisible in law, in history, in commerce, in politics, in all the ways that matter. In the prologue to Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison gave voice to this all too common experience, as he said, "I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me." And so much of what we call progress is really increased visibility, coming out of the shadows of prejudice into the bright light of community. To be invisible in modern America, in this age of social networks, is to be unrecognized in a moment of constant attention seeking, whether online, on television, or in real life. The fear of slipping into oblivion is perhaps even more palpable here in South Carolina. In addition to coping with what is now a permanent war on terror, limited access to affordable health care, and lingering effects of the Great Recession, some South Carolinians find their very way of life under threat. This fear of insignificance emerged in the most horrific way when a disturbed young man from my hometown committed an act of terror almost 1 year ago. The murders in Mother Emanuel were the death rattle of an ideology that continues to venerate a social caste system as a means of preserving power and privilege. Nevertheless, reaction was swift and decisive. The Confederate battle flag no longer flies on the grounds of the South Carolina State House. Alabama shortly followed by removing the flag from state property. License plates featuring the flag no longer are available in Georgia and Virginia. Confederate flag merchandise no longer is available in Walmart or Sears or online at Amazon or eBay. The link between Southern secession and slavery finally is clear and undeniable. The flag has been a divisive symbol, to be sure, but it remains just that, a symbol. Exactly 11 months to the day of the Emanuel shootings, today, and 62 years today after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the question remains, where does South Carolina go from here? And if the state is to truly exhibit amazing grace, if it's to truly exhibit amazing grace, it can no longer, in the words of Ralph Ellison, refuse to see its own people. Lost in the tributes to Mother Emanuel and the people who died there was that it took Dylann Roof's actions to educate the broader public about the church's history. A symbol of liberation and struggle, Mother Emanuel had been hiding in plain sight on Calhoun Street prior to being discovered by papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. In much the same way, and appropriate to remember today, the origins of Brown versus Board in Somerton, South Carolina, as Briggs versus Elliott, remain largely unknown and unexplored among the majority of South Carolinians, as does Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategic retreats at Penn Center, as does the Orangeburg Massacre, as does Thurgood Marshall's friendship with Majeska Simpkins, and on and on and on and on. We have rendered invisible marginalized communities throughout the state. from the mill villages of the upstate to the growing Latino communities in rural and suburban areas to the Native American settlements that predate colonization. My interest in making visible the invisible has less to do with simple representation, though that is a laudable goal, and more to do with expanding notions of what it means to be a South Carolinian, and by extension, what it means to be a Southerner. For too long, that which is Southern has only been defined by those who are committed to the least honest portrayal of what it means to grow up in the Southland. I am a proud South Carolinian, and I am a proud Southerner. This region is and has always been a cultural crossroads, and it is long past time for the complexity and richness of its past, present, and future to be recognized. But someone has to make that so, and that's where you come in. There has to be an ask here at some point, right? The fact that you are here tonight indicates that you are at least willing to consider a broader conception of what it means to be a Southerner. Warts and all. No need to sugarcoat it, just tell the truth and be complete. I can think of no better model for this work than the countless hours, days, months, years put in by our dear friend Calder Ehrman. I know I continue to learn from his example and continue to be challenged to live my life in a way that honors his legacy. And every time I see Glenda, I'm reminded of that. And it's really been one of the joys of my life. One of the last times I was here in Greenville, I also had the privilege of sharing the stage with Steve Morrison, a lawyer at Secretary Riley's law firm who works tirelessly on behalf of what he called his kids in the corridor of shame. And one of my greatest joys was the last time I saw Steve, he started to call me by the nickname that only my family and my friends call me. And every time he saw me after that, he would call me by that name. Of course, the work of Secretary Riley is firmly in line with the respect for every aspect of our Southern heritage and identity. And at the core of the work of people like Calder and Steve and the Secretary is that they sought to recognize those whom others refused to see. They were explorers in search of human potential. And I suspect we will benefit from their discoveries for years to come. But that's not enough. That's not enough to pay proper respect to the memory of the Calders of this world, and it's not enough to move South Carolina forward. When we talk about the good works of people like Lottie Gibson, like Calder Ehrman, like Wendell Jones, like Russell Booker, like Harold Cheatham, like Anna Kate Hipp, like Peggy Baxter, like Xanthine Norris, like Baxter Wynn, and on and on and on and on. What we really are talking about are gifts. Having just celebrated Jonah's birthday, I've been thinking a lot about gifts lately and what we do with them. Ideally, when we receive gifts, we open them. We don't re-gift them. We open them. We use them. We don't leave them unopened, unused, and forgotten. When we give gifts, we do it out of love, out of care, and out of thoughtfulness, with no expectation of receiving anything in return. In our best moments, gifts are transformative, both for the giver and the recipient. And those who have deployed their gifts in this way clearly make up what my friend Bernie Dunlap likes to describe as the army of the just. And rather than focus on makers and takers like we did in the last presidential election, let's concentrate on the givers and receivers. Consider what leadership would look like if we focused on who was most authentic in sharing their talents and receiving guidance and wisdom from others. Imagine if we demanded that our leaders be givers and receivers. And that is exactly what we should do. At the same time, we should follow our own advice in this regard. Being a giver and receiver requires no superhuman ability. All it takes is the ability to identify what you do well and seek to be excellent in the doing of it. Not just good enough, not simply to the degree that you don't stand out, you don't call attention to yourself. As Oprah Winfrey said, so it must be true, you can't go around dimming your light just to be walking with someone else. Let your light so shine. Let your light shine if we are truly to honor the memory of those 9 givers and receivers in Emmanuel who died 11 months ago today. Let your light shine if we're to truly honor the efforts of the parents and children in Somerton, Topeka, and elsewhere that resulted in a decisive victory for equality 62 years ago today. Let your light shine if we're to create opportunity for all South Carolinians and bring truth to what it means to be both a South Carolinian and a Southerner. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. If we've learned anything over the past 11 months, it is that life is precious. It has meaning. It matters. As leaders, we all have a part to play. So please accept this as my first offering, this little light of mine. I'm going to let it shine. Now it's your turn. Thank you.